Isabella Garcia never wanted to be noticed. She wasn't the kind of woman who craved an audience or measured her worth in online attention. She believed in work, honest, deliberate, back-breaking work. She wore denim like skin, smelled faintly of salt and lacquer, and lived each day with the quiet resolve of someone who had nothing to prove and everything to protect. The workshop on Shoreline Avenue had belonged to her late father, Alejandro, a Cuban immigrant, who, after decades of grinding labor, he had built a reputation in the region for restoring boats better than anyone within 3 counties. He had a craftsman's soul and a soldier's precision. His death 5 years ago left behind not just his name, but his entire operation, the faded green boathouse facing the bay, the dock with the rusted cleats, the tools perfectly arranged on pegboards with faded chalk outlines, and an aging roster of local clients who refused to let anyone else touch their vessels. When Isabella buried him, she buried her grief in the boatyard and kept everything running, just like he would have wanted. She never updated the signage. The Garcia Daughter Marine Restoration letters, hand-painted in navy blue across the top of the corrugated steel facade, were beginning to peel, but she left them. Tourists mistook the place for abandoned, and that suited her just fine. Her customers came by appointment or habit, mostly older men who ran charter services or fished alone, men who wore their years like badges and didn't care if the paint job wasn't glossy as long as it lasted through storms. Isabella handled everything: engine mountings, fiberglass patching, strip varnishing, dockside pickups. Her hands were always calloused, her nails always stained. She worked with the rhythm of tide and time, unhurried but relentless. For over 20 years, she had seen the town change. Shoreline Avenue had once been considered out of the way, too close to the marshes, too exposed to the elements, too far from real property. But over the past decade, investors had begun to circle like gulls over fresh catch. They called it untapped coastal potential. Young couples from the city with startup money moved into boxy prefab homes and converted the old textile mill into a craft brewery and yoga studio. Property values soared. Real estate signs popped up like weeds. Isabella watched quietly, arms crossed, as her quiet, blue-collar corridor began to fill with white CSEs and high-end kayaks. She didn't mind the changes as long as they left her alone, and for a while they did. Then came the committee. They weren't called the Homeowners Association, not formally. This particular stretch of the bay was managed by the Community Standards Advisory Council, a title so vague it bordered on parody. But it had teeth. Backed by private developers and embedded deeply in the town council, the committee had the authority to guide aesthetic cohesion, promote safety and compliance, and facilitate value-oriented land use. In simpler terms, they told people what to do with their own land and punished those who didn't listen. At first, they ignored Isabella, perhaps assuming her business would fade out naturally. She wasn't selling, and she wasn't interested in meetings. She didn't vote in local elections, didn't put up yard signs, and never showed up at town hall. That didn't sit well with people who thought silence was the same as consent. Isabella had heard whispers. Other legacy businesses nearby, an old crab shack, a sheet metal garage, a bait and tackle shop, all gone within the last 2 years. Officially, they had closed for financial reasons. But she'd heard a different story from Pete, the harbor welder, before he packed up and moved north. It's death by ordinance, he had said. One fine after another. One restriction after the next. They wear you down until you just stop fighting. She had taken his words seriously, but not personally. Pete ran his books like a blackjack table. Isabella had all her licenses in order. Her taxes were filed. Her inspections were up to date. She wasn't going anywhere. But on a Thursday morning in late March, she pulled up to the lot in her battered Chevy pickup and found her entrance completely blocked by 3 commercial dumpsters lined side by side like a barricade. Each one was massive industrial grade, meant for construction debris, and bore the fluorescent logo of a waste disposal service she didn't recognize. They weren't hers. They weren't anyone's she had authorized. Affixed to the front of each was a plastic sleeve containing a laminated sign. The font was official, the language evasive temporary closure for sanitary mitigation community enforcement initiative. She parked at the curb, stunned. There were no warning notices, no letters, no emails, no visits, nothing. She tried calling the number listed at the bottom of the sign. A recorded voice answered and thanked her for contacting the Bayfront Compliance Hotline. After 3 menu options and 10 minutes on hold, the line went dead. She tried again. Same result. She wasn't the kind to panic, but this wasn't just an inconvenience. Her tools, her office, her entire livelihood was behind those bins. If she couldn't open today, she'd have to start canceling appointments. And if she couldn't access the Bay slip by the weekend, she'd lose 2 regulars. She paced in front of the entrance, weighing her options, her jaw tightening. That afternoon, she walked a half-mile uphill to the committee's temporary office in a remodeled community center that used to be a senior dance hall. The woman at the front desk was young, over-perfumed, and reading a novel under the desk. Isabella asked to speak to someone about the dumpsters. The receptionist barely looked up. "Do you have an enforcement citation number?" "No, I wasn't given anything. My shop was just blocked this morning without notice. If there's no citation number, I can't pull up a case." Isabella narrowed her eyes, "Then find someone who can." The receptionist slowly picked up the phone and made a single call, eyes still half on her book. A few minutes later, a door at the back of the lobby opened, and out stepped a woman Isabella had seen only in passing at a zoning meeting once, and in a photo taped to the wall of the cafe near the wharf. Karen Flowers, committee chair, large, immaculately dressed in soft neutrals and pale pinks, with perfect curls and a smile as hollow as a church bell. She greeted Isabella with a warmth that immediately felt like a threat. "Ms. Garcia," she said with mock surprise, extending her manicured hand. "How wonderful to finally meet in person. What brings you in today?" Isabella didn't take her hand. "Someone put 3 dumpsters across the entrance to my business. They're not mine. They're not legal. I want them gone." Karen's smile didn't falter. "Yes, of course. We've had several reports, just informal ones, you understand, about the state of your property. Odors, chemical runoff, unsafe materials being stored improperly. Our team conducted a preliminary external observation last week and decided that some temporary remediation measures might be necessary until a full site inspection can be scheduled." "There's nothing unsafe about my shop," Isabella said flatly. "I've passed every inspection since 2009. This is harassment." Karen tilted her head sympathetically, as if consoling a small child. "I understand this feels sudden, but please try to see this from a community health perspective. We're simply following procedure. Once the inspection is complete, and if everything checks out, I'm sure the matter will be resolved quickly." "When?" Isabella asked. Karen paused. "That depends on scheduling. There's a bit of a backlog at the moment, but you'll be notified." And with that, she turned and left. That night, Isabella sat alone in the small kitchenette above her shop, staring at a cooling cup of black coffee, but her hands still coated in dust from a sanding job she never got to finish. She had lived her entire life by the rules, paid her dues, followed the laws, fixed what was broken, and now, for the first time in years, she felt something cold and old stirring in her chest, not fear, not quite, but a kind of insulted clarity. Someone wanted her gone. She didn't know why not yet, but it wouldn't matter. Because if they thought she was going to quietly pack up and walk away like the others, they didn't know her at all. And if they were going to block her path with garbage, she'd show them exactly how she moved trash. The following morning, Isabella woke up earlier than usual. She hadn't slept well. Her dreams were tangled and feverish, full of sounds that weren't quite real, metal scraping on concrete, voices that dissolved when she turned toward them. She sat on the edge of the cot she kept upstairs, slipped on her boots without tying them, and went downstairs. The workshop was still dark, and the weak morning light trickled through the frosted glass panes, casting stripes across the dust-covered floor. She opened the side door slowly, as if something might have changed overnight, though she already knew better. The dumpsters were still there, their dull gray sides now covered in streaks of salt spray and bird droppings. One of them had shifted slightly in the wind, angling just enough to expose a heavy-duty padlock on its wheelbase. She stood there for several minutes, staring at them, arms crossed over her chest, jaw tight. Then she went back inside, brewed a pot of coffee so strong it could have dissolved rust, and started calling every client she had scheduled for the week. It was humiliating. These were men she'd worked with for years, some of them since her father's time, and though not one of them expressed anger or blame, every call left her feeling smaller. They understood. They always did. But it didn't make the knot in her stomach loosen. Every cancellation was money lost, yes, but it was also a crack in her reputation. Word traveled fast in small communities. If people thought her business was in trouble, it wouldn't matter how good she was, they'd start going elsewhere, even out of caution. She didn't have a storefront or a social media presence to rely on. Everything she had was built on word of mouth and years of steady, no bullshit work. By noon, Isabella had made a decision. The committee wasn't going to move those dumpsters, and she wasn't going to wait weeks for some phantom inspection that may or may not exist. She drove out to the edge of town, where a landscaping equipment rental yard sat behind a chain-link fence. The owner, Gus, a thick-necked man with too many sunburns and an easy laugh, recognized her right away. He raised an eyebrow when she asked for a forklift. "You got a dock job?" "No," she replied. "I've got an obstruction." Gus chuckled, then narrowed his eyes when she handed over her ID. "This about those bins on Shoreline?" "I didn't say it was. You didn't have to. Word's getting around. You gonna move them yourself?" "I'm not doing anything illegal," she said evenly. That's what they always say right before they make the local paper. She signed the rental agreement, declined the insurance, and drove the diesel-powered forklift back to her shop in low gear, its engine growling through the residential blocks like a threat. It was a ridiculous sight, and she knew it, a compact woman with a braid tucked into a fraying work jacket, piloting a slow-moving industrial machine through streets lined with coastal condos and Range Rovers. People turned to look. A man watering his succulents dropped his hose. A dog started barking from behind a fence. But Isabella didn't stop or smile or wave. She maneuvered that steel beast like she'd done it 100 times, rolled up to the barricade, and stopped just short of the first dumpster. She climbed down, inspected the lock on the wheels, retrieved a bolt cutter from her truck, and with one sharp motion clack, the lock snapped and clattered to the pavement. Then she got back on, lowered the forks, eased them under the bin, and began to lift. It was heavier than she expected, probably half full of concrete or construction waste, maybe even loaded on purpose to make it harder to move. But the forklift didn't complain, just strained slightly, its hydraulics hissing. She turned slowly, carefully, and deposited the first dumpster on the empty lot across the street, one that had been for sale for nearly 2 years but never found a buyer. It wasn't private property, not anymore. Then she came back for the second, and the third. By the time she was done, she'd cleared her entire entrance, and the 3 dumpsters now sat in a neat row like prisoners awaiting trial. She didn't say a word, didn't call anyone, just parked the forklift, locked it, and went inside. She got 2 hours of work in before the first knock came. It wasn't the police. Not yet. It was someone from the committee, a man she'd seen once or twice but never spoken to directly. He was young, overdressed, with a clipboard in one hand and a self-important air that didn't quite mask his discomfort. She answered the door with a wrench in hand. "Miss Garcia," he began, clearing his throat. "We've received a report that you tampered with waste infrastructure installed under municipal guidance." "I moved garbage," she replied. "It was blocking my business. You were advised not to interfere with safety mitigation structures pending inspection." I wasn't advised of anything. I was ambushed. He blinked. This may be escalated to a violation proceeding. I'm obligated to inform you that obstruction of enforcement protocols. I didn't obstruct. I removed the obstruction. He looked down at his clipboard, hesitated, then tried again. We'll be reviewing your case at the next standards hearing. You may be requested to attend, then send me the request. She closed the door before he could reply. The next day, she received an official letter from the Community Compliance Board printed on thick ivory paper, with language that tried very hard to sound like law. The letter stated that due to a history of non-cooperation and unauthorized modifications to the enforcement landscape, her business would be temporarily restricted from operational activity for a 10-day period, pending full site review and environmental clearance. No hearing, no due process, just a formal shutdown. The letter wasn't signed by anyone. It was just stamped. Isabella folded the paper, tucked it into a drawer, and sat down at her workbench. Her hands were shaking. Not from fear, not quite, but something colder, a kind of pressure she hadn't felt in years. A long, creeping unease that made the air feel heavy. It wasn't just the shutdown, it was the silence around it. The fact that no one seemed to blink. Her calls to the permit office went unanswered. The waste management company denied any involvement, claimed they had no record of a service request for that address. She contacted the business liaison in city planning, the same woman who had approved her annual renewal back in January, and got a voicemail that had been changed overnight. She called her lawyer. Carla Maynard wasn't cheap, but she was good, an older woman who had fought enough land use cases to know how these games were played. Isabella explained the situation. Carla listened quietly. "Sounds like a soft kill," she said finally. "What does that mean?" "They're not coming at you legally. Not yet. They're using procedural erosion. Cut off your access, starve your clients, bury you in delays until you fold on your own. They can't just do that. They can if you let them." Carla told her she'd file for a protective injunction, request discovery on any and all permits related to the dumpsters, they'd issue a cease and desist on retaliatory enforcement actions. But she warned her this wouldn't be fast. These things rarely were. The committee didn't move like a court. It moved like a machine. That night, Isabella sat on the dock behind her shop, staring out across the water. The bay was calm, windless. A few gulls circled overhead, and lights blinked in the distance from passing boats. She had always loved this time of day, the blue hour, her father called it. The moment when the world held its breath between day and night. It used to be peaceful. Now it felt hollow. She looked back at her shop, the only thing she had left of him, of her childhood, of the life they built one plank at a time. It was more than a business. It was her anchor. And someone was trying to cut the line, but she wouldn't let them. Not without a fight. 3 days passed before Carla received the first response from the committee's legal department. It was brief, evasive, and layered in careful ambiguity, a non-answer disguised as formality. They claimed the containers had been placed by an external partner, conducting an emergency sanitation initiative, and that all actions had been taken in compliance with environmental safety triggers authorized by regional oversight bodies. The language was deliberately vague, engineered not to inform but to exhaust. The names of these bodies were never listed. No dates, no signatories. Only dense bureaucratic language that looped back on itself like a snake devouring its own tail. The only concrete statement was a refusal to move the bins back or clarify who had authorized them, citing a pending resolution process. Carla forwarded the message to Isabella with a single line typed beneath. "They're playing rope-a-dope. Stay steady." But Isabella was already feeling the slow bleed, not just in her business, but in her patience. Every day she couldn't open chipped away at her rhythm, her confidence, her equilibrium. The silence around her was changing in texture. Neighbors who once nodded politely now avoided eye contact. A regular client, retired Coast Guard, usually early to every appointment, left her a voicemail canceling indefinitely, claiming he just wanted to wait until things were sorted out. vendors she'd worked with for years suddenly began requesting upfront payments. A freight delivery she'd scheduled was mysteriously redirected to another dock across town with no explanation, and the company refused to reschedule until clearance issues were resolved. No one could say who was flagging her. No one admitted to knowing what was going on. It was like her name had been added to some invisible list, and from that moment on, everything bent slightly out of reach. She wasn't paranoid. She was watching herself be isolated in real time. On the fifth day, her email account, a personal server she'd used for 15 years, was temporarily suspended due to excessive login attempts. She hadn't changed her password in a decade. The hosting provider said the breach came from a localized cluster somewhere nearby. They couldn't prove it, of course. Just like no one could prove who filed the anonymous complaint that triggered a random audit from the town's tax assessor, who showed up with a clipboard and a rehearsed apology. He barely stepped inside before taking 30 photographs of her walls and saying he'd need to confirm the square footage against historical registry files. 2 days later, she received notice that her property had been reclassified and might be subject to new zoning rates. It wasn't official, just under review. Everything was under review. That same week, the committee posted a public memo not mailed, not emailed, but taped to the outside of her building with heavy-duty adhesive so strong she had to use a heat gun to remove it. The paper was thick, water-resistant, stamped with the seal of the advisory council and riddled with euphemisms, unlicensed structural appendages, non-compliant material storage, unsanctioned proximity to wetland drainage points. The tone was surgical, as if her family business were some rotting appendix the town needed to cut out before it spread. There was no reference to her name, but it didn't need one. It was addressed to occupant, Bayfront parcel 33 billion. She'd memorized that parcel number as a child, helping her father fill out old state forms. That night, she climbed to the roof of the shop, something she hadn't done in years, and stood quietly in the cold breeze, staring out at the black expanse of water that curled against the docks like a sleeping animal. She listened for something. Anything, maybe for the old sounds of boat horns or her father's radio crackling through the open workshop door, but heard only the hum of distant traffic and the faint drone of a neighbor's pool heater. She wanted to scream, not out of desperation, but defiance. Instead, she lit a cigarette she didn't need and exhaled slowly, watching the smoke rise like an offering to no one. The next morning, her breaker box was tripped. The building had no power. No lights, no tools, no ventilation system. When she checked the lock, it hadn't been broken. Nothing looked tampered with. The padlock was in place, and the screws in the panel were untouched. Yet inside, 2 circuits had been physically flipped. Carla warned her that if she filed a police report without proof of trespassing, they'd do nothing. So Isabella installed a set of motion sensor cameras with cloud backup, not because she was afraid, but because she needed a record. She wasn't documenting a crime, she was building a case. A few nights later, she got what she was waiting for. At 2:38 a.m., a figure approached her workshop from the west side, cutting across the adjacent lot. The camera's infrared filter rendered the figure in high contrast bulky, hooded, moving with the rigid, purposeful gait of someone trying not to appear sneaky but failing. The figure paused near her breaker box for nearly 6 minutes, then turned away without touching anything. Before disappearing, they tore down the public memo that had been reposted that morning by the committee, as if erasing their own work or taunting her. Isabella watched the footage on loop the next morning, noting the posture, the angle of approach, the fact that they never once looked up toward the camera. She sent it to Carla, who forwarded it to a contact in the insurance sector, hoping to build a file in case damages escalated. But the most invasive blow came from within. Isabella received a letter, this one not from a faceless counsel, but from her bank. It was politely worded and devastatingly cold. Due to increased regional risk factors and potential legal encumbrances, her business line of credit had been temporarily suspended pending a compliance review. Her account remained open, but she no longer had access to her cushion. Without it, every tool replacement, every bulk order, every sudden cost now came out of pocket. She was solvent, but barely. If something really broke, she'd be forced to delay repairs, and delays were fatal in a business where timing was half the value. She didn't cry. She didn't break anything. She didn't call anyone. She went downstairs, opened the back door, and walked to the edge of her dock. The water was low. The moon was high. She crouched down, dipped her fingers in the bay, and thought about what it had taken to hold on to this place for so long, not just financially, but emotionally. The shop was more than just a structure. It was a memory suspended in wood and metal, a ritual inherited from a man who never gave up even when it cost him his back, his health, and eventually his life. The idea that anyone could sweep it away with a letter or a ruling or a bureaucratic shrug ignited something deep in her chest. The following morning, she started making calls not to the town, not to the committee, but to former clients who had ties in infrastructure. One of them, a quietly loyal man named Wendell, connected her with a contact in city utilities who agreed to audit the records of her address. What he found wasn't illegal, but it was telling. Multiple concerns had been logged about her property from anonymous sources over the last 2 months, each one triggering a separate review: zoning, environmental permit, access. None of the reports were substantive. Most were just vague phrases like strong chemical odors, unsafe tools left outside, or increased rodent activity. It was death by rumor. Carla filed a formal public record request and discovered that the individual who had submitted at least 3 of the reports used a registered committee login under the name KFlowers_CSA, Karen Flowers. Isabella stared at the document for a long time, heart quiet but eyes sharp. So it wasn't procedural. It was personal. She wasn't just in the way. She was being removed. That night, she walked the perimeter of her lot, flashlight in hand, scanning every inch of fence, every inch of her walls, every corner that could be turned into leverage. She took notes, measured angles, photographed utility boxes. She began assembling a war room in the corner of her workshop, not out of obsession, but necessity. Maps, records, filings. She didn't know where this was going, but she wasn't going to be caught unprepared. She wasn't planning to win through force. She was planning to survive through proof. And proof would come, one document at a time, one night at a time, until they were out of tactics and out of lies. She wasn't going anywhere. It was on the 9th day of the enforced closure that something shifted, not in Isabella, but around her. By then, the rhythm of her days had changed entirely. She no longer woke to begin work, but to scan for new signs of interference. Her boots carried the weight of constant vigilance, and her movements had become those of someone who didn't trust stillness. There was no longer any illusion of misunderstanding. Every call unanswered, every file missing from a clerk's drawer, every procedural phrase echoed with intention. There was a design behind all of it, and the architecture of that design became clearer each time she peeled back another layer. The facade of civility, the false charm of Karen Flowers, the deliberate opacity of every document and letter, all of it was carefully engineered to drain her strength, not just to stop her work, but to make her abandon the will to fight for it. And yet she hadn't folded. She hadn't screamed or shown her teeth, not yet. She had simply endured, filing, documenting, recording, building the slow wall of evidence brick by brick. But endurance wasn't enough anymore. Carla knew it, and so did Isabella. The committee had cornered her in the shadows of process. The only way out was light. Not scandal, not public outcry. Isabella didn't believe in mobs with phones, but something colder and harder: disclosure. Carla filed a petition to force a formal records hearing regarding the use of municipally co-signed compliance measures in non-residential zones. That hearing, if accepted by the Administrative Review Board, would compel the committee to submit internal justifications for their actions against Isabella's property. It was a bureaucratic long shot, the kind of move lawyers usually filed just to buy time or delay foreclosure proceedings, but Carla believed in friction. If you couldn't punch through the system, you made it trip over itself. 3 days later, the petition was inexplicably accepted. That alone was strange. The review board had a long-standing reputation for siding with established counsels, and very few independent businesses had ever gotten this far without media pressure or class action leverage. Isabella suspected Carla had called in favors, but she didn't ask. The hearing was scheduled in 12 days. That was 12 days to survive, 12 days to gather and seal every thread, every whisper, every scrap of paper that could illuminate how far this network of quiet sabotage reached. She doubled her efforts. Not with vengeance, that wasn't her language, but with sharp, tactical precision. She requested archival plats from the records office, dating back to her father's first boundary filing in 1986. She combed through town hall meeting minutes going back 4 years, noting when Karen Flowers had first introduced language suggesting aesthetic oversight for commercial structures adjacent to residential upgrades. She highlighted instances where vote counts were omitted. She tracked overlapping signatures from resident complaints and found the same 6 names recycled under different addresses. It was methodical and exhausting, but the pieces began to align. This wasn't a single incident. It was a pattern, a test case, a way to drive out legacy businesses and reclaim the land under the guise of cleanliness, compliance, and forward development. The pressure grew quieter but sharper. Her mail began arriving torn. A box of resin compound she'd ordered from a trusted vendor arrived punctured and leaking. The vendor said the damage had occurred during final handling. Her workshop's water pressure dropped by 70% overnight. The utility company said maintenance work had been done on a line nearby, though no one on her street reported an outage. At night, she began hearing unfamiliar vehicles idle down the road and stop just outside the range of her exterior lights. Sometimes they moved on quickly. Sometimes they didn't. She never approached them. She simply stood by the window, arms crossed, and waited. It was during one of those nights just past 11 p.m., after she'd shut off the tools and stacked her paperwork, that a knock came at the side entrance. It wasn't loud, but it was deliberate. 3 slow raps. She reached for the crowbar she kept near the door, flicked on the porch floodlight, and opened it without a word. Standing in front of her was a woman in her early 40s, dressed like she had just come from a jog hoodie, runners, no purse. Her face was unfamiliar, but her posture wasn't threatening. She looked tense, not predatory. She didn't introduce herself. "You don't know me," the woman said, her voice low. "But I used to work under Karen. Community research logistics. 2 years ago. Quit last spring." Isabella said nothing, but her silence wasn't empty. "I heard what they're doing to you," the woman went on. "I've seen it before. The dumpers, the fake environmental memos, the random assessments. It's all part of what they call Phase D. D for disruption. It's designed to make you spend money faster than you can make it, then make you look like a liability on paper, so the city can reclaim the parcel." Still silent, Isabella tilted her head, studying her. "I'm not asking you to trust me," the woman added, "but I've got copies of internal strategy memos. Not many, just fragments, but they name your business. They've been trying to push through a zoning overhaul for the entire shoreline. Your parcel's at the edge of what they call the conversion radius." The term hit like a nail driven into wood. "Why are you telling me this now?" Isabella asked, finally. "Because you're the first one who's pushed back and gotten a hearing. They're scrambling. They didn't expect it to go that far. Someone higher up's not happy. I figured maybe it was time someone leveled the field." She didn't give her name. She just passed over a padded envelope and left into the night. Isabella watched her disappear between 2 houses, then locked the door and turned back toward the workshop's overhead light. Inside the envelope were 9 pages, mostly printed emails, heavily redacted, but enough to see language like pilot removal zone, targeted transition, and secure influence. One document listed her property by name and parcel number. Another outlined proposed incentives to be offered to incoming investors pending vacancy of legacy commercial footprint. It was written 6 months ago. The next morning, Isabella brought the documents to Carla, who stared at them for a long time without speaking. "We can't use them in court," she said eventually. "They're not traceable. No clear chain of custody. The redactions could be challenged." I figured. But if we present them indirectly, say, reference their existence while requesting further disclosure under administrative review, it might pressure them into early resolution. They'll deny everything. They always do. But what matters now is leverage. And this, she said, tapping the packet, is leverage. Carla contacted the administrative board to request supplemental documentation subpoenas. Within 48 hours, the committee's legal team responded with an offer: voluntary withdrawal of all current citations, return of business access rights, and suspension of enforcement activity for 60 days in exchange for non-litigation assurance. Carla read the terms aloud slowly, then lowered the paper. "They're blinking." Isabella shook her head. "It's bait." Carla nodded. "I agree. They want you to take the deal, drop the hearing, and disappear. No ruling, no record, no precedent. What happens if we go through with the hearing? They'll fight like hell. But if we win, even a partial win, it could establish the committee's overreach as a formal violation of procedural conduct. That opens the door to claims of targeted interference and abuse of municipal process. And if we lose?" Carla looked her square in the eye. "Then they'll come after you harder. Every permit, every inspection, every inch of that property." Isabella sat back, breathing through her nose, staring out the office window at nothing. The choice wasn't between safety and danger. It was between retreat and exposure. She could keep the shop, maybe, and live under permanent scrutiny, or she could push forward and risk everything, not out of pride, but to make the record clean, to make the truth visible. She chose the second. And once that decision settled into her bones, something in her posture changed. She stopped bracing for the next strike. She started preparing for the last one. The days leading up to the administrative hearing moved with the slow inevitability of a tide shifting beneath the surface, imperceptible in motion, yet impossible to stop. From the outside, the shop on parcel 33 billion remained unchanged, the same worn facade, the same faded signage, the same silence between working hours. But inside, Isabella was dismantling the last pieces of illusion. This was no longer a standoff about zoning or environmental compliance, or even the obstruction of a business. It was a tactical siege not fought with weapons, but with processes, delays, pressures. The committee had taken what began as passive resistance and turned it into a full-court offensive, and now that she had refused their offer of quiet surrender, they were prepared to show their teeth. The first sign came the morning after her decision. A code enforcement officer arrived at her lot unannounced this time, with a uniformed police officer in tow, standing just far enough behind to remain symbolic but not quite detached. The officer didn't say a word, he didn't have to. The inspector cited Isabella for improper material containment, pointing to 2 sealed barrels of marine-grade epoxy that had been stacked behind the storage shed barrels she had purchased legally and stored according to manufacturer protocol. When she asked what statute had been violated, he cited a clause she didn't recognize and refused to elaborate. The citation listed a fine of $950, due within 7 business days. Carla filed an immediate objection and requested the statute language in full. 3 days later, the fine was rescinded, entry error, they said, but the warning was clear: the gloves were off. The next attack came from an angle Isabella hadn't anticipated. A new notice was taped to her mailbox, this one not from the committee, not from zoning, not even from the town. It was from her insurance carrier. Due to recent changes in surrounding land designation and anticipated reclassification of commercial zoning, her liability coverage had been flagged for reevaluation. Effective immediately, Her policy would require supplemental inspections for continued coverage. Without passing those inspections, the policy would lapse in 30 days. The phrasing was technical, but the intent was surgical. If they couldn't shut her down through code, they would squeeze her through risk. She called the insurance company, demanded clarification, demanded to know who had initiated the reclassification. The answer was a familiar deflection. It's part of an automated flagging process based on updates from local land use data. She pressed. Which update? Silence. The representative eventually admitted the request came from a municipal affiliate data feed connected to the regional planning board. Carla submitted a request for transparency under the Public Records Act. They denied it, citing internal coordination protections. It was a wall of legal fog, thick and deliberate. That night, Isabella went out to check the security cameras. Everything looked fine. No movement, no interference. She adjusted the angles slightly, made sure the cloud sync was active, then stood in the driveway staring at the edge of the property, where the boundary fence met the overgrown lot next door. Something felt different, not visible, but present. The grass had been pressed down, the weeds broken. Someone had been walking along that edge. She found no footprints, but a torn strip of white painter's tape clung to the fence post, the kind used to mark boundaries during survey work. She hadn't seen it the day before. At 2:14 a.m., her exterior lights flickered briefly, then came back on. Nothing was tripped, no fuses blown, no recorded surge, just a flicker enough to catch her attention and nothing more. When she reviewed the security footage in the morning, the timestamp during the flicker showed brief static, as though the feed had been disrupted for less than a second. She archived it, labeled it, and sent it to Carla with the note, "They're getting creative." By now, the tone of the committee's correspondence had changed. No more euphemisms. No more gentle phrasing. The newest letter, signed by Karen Flowers herself, formally accused Isabella of engaging in deliberate provocation and patterns of antagonistic behavior inconsistent with regional development harmony. The language was borderline laughable, but the implications weren't. The letter included a formal notice that the committee would be recommending a complete reassessment of her permit eligibility in light of cumulative behavioral patterns. Carla responded with a blistering legal memorandum, accusing the committee of retaliatory administrative conduct and demanding that no further action be taken until the upcoming hearing. But the damage was already rippling. 2 of Isabella's suppliers suspended scheduled deliveries, citing a review of contractual liability exposure. A local dock worker she'd used for years ghosted her without explanation. Another client admitted in a voice thick with guilt that he'd been warned, off the record, that any continued affiliation with Garcia daughter might put his own marina applications under heavier scrutiny. It wasn't a boycott. It was a soft quarantine. Still, she continued to work. She sanded down a deck for a boat she hadn't been paid for yet. She revarnished a rudder out of habit. She restocked basic supplies out of pocket, unwilling to let the shelves sit empty even as the hours dragged. It was less about productivity now and more about anchoring herself, refusing to surrender the rhythm of labor, even when the outside world tried to unweave it thread by thread. By thread. The night before the hearing, the final move came. She returned home from a late errand picking up replacement fittings from a hardware store 2 towns over. Since her local supplier had stopped answering calls and found the back door to her workshop slightly ajar. She froze. Nothing was broken. The latch was still intact. No alarms had gone off. But she had locked that door. She always did. She stepped inside slowly, scanning. The interior looked untouched, tools in place, paperwork stacked as she left it. But her desk drawer was open. Not torn open, just left ajar like someone had examined it and decided not to bother pretending otherwise. Inside, the envelope containing copies of the redacted documents, the ones given to her by the woman in the hoodie, was missing. The hard copies Carla had secured at her office were safe, but these had been the only ones Isabella had kept on site. She didn't call the police. She simply installed a new deadbolt, replaced the latch, repositioned the cameras, and sat in her truck for an hour staring at the fence line, watching nothing. The next morning, she dressed in her father's old jacket, heavy canvas, too warm for spring, and drove to the municipal building where the hearing was to take place. Carla met her at the curb. She looked calm, as always, but her tone was clipped, urgent. "They're going to try to block the evidence," she said quietly. "They filed a motion this morning to dismiss any third-party documentation on grounds of inadmissible acquisition. They can't do that. They can try. But I filed a response. We'll see how the board rules." They walked together up the concrete steps. It wasn't a courthouse, not exactly. The hearing was being held in a repurposed zoning annex, with bad lighting and old carpet that smelled like mildew and photocopier toner. The hearing board consisted of 3 officials, 2 from the planning department, 1 from environmental review, none of whom made eye contact as Isabella and Carla entered the room. Karen was already seated at the opposite table, flanked by 2 men in stiff suits. She smiled when she saw Isabella, but it wasn't a smile of warmth, it was one of fatigue, as if to say, "Still here?" How tedious. The hearing began. Carla opened with a detailed outline of procedural violations committed against Isabella's business: lack of notice, false citations, untraceable enforcement orders, and interference with third-party services. She introduced copies of Isabella's permits, inspection records, and documentation from city utilities showing targeted outages. Then came the envelope, carefully introduced as a compiled document set from an anonymous source with former affiliation to the committee, cited not for content but to justify the request for broader internal disclosure under Section 22C of the Administrative Accountability Code. Karen's team objected immediately. Carla anticipated it. The board deliberated for 21 minutes. When they returned, they allowed the documents provisionally and ordered the committee to provide internal correspondence regarding enforcement justifications for parcel 33 billion within 10 business days. It wasn't a ruling, but it was a crack in the armor. Isabella didn't smile. She didn't even shift her posture. But inside, something old and rooted exhaled for the first time in weeks. The board adjourned. Outside, in the parking lot, Carla turned to her. "They're going to come harder now," she said. "I know. Are you ready for that?" "I've been ready since they put the first dumpster down." Carla nodded. They didn't shake hands. There was no ceremony. But when Isabella drove home, the door was locked, the lights were on, and the wind across the bay was still. The morning after the hearing, Isabella found a dead fish nailed to her dock gate. It wasn't subtle. It wasn't clever. It wasn't even the kind of threat that tried to conceal its intent beneath layers of implication or deniability. It was old-fashioned intimidation, blunt and grotesque and deliberately beneath the dignity of bureaucracy. She stood over it for a while, her breath slow and even, the brackish air settling around her like a film. The fish was a blueback herring, its eye already clouded, its tail stiff. The nail had been driven through its spine and into the wood with enough force to crack one of the slats. She didn't touch it. She simply cut out the entire board and dropped the ruined plank into the burn bin behind the shop. That same afternoon, her power went out again. Not a flicker this time, complete failure. Every breaker intact. Her neighbor's lights stayed on. When she called the utility company, they claimed her account had been flagged for unusual activity and scheduled a technician for 5 days later. She didn't wait. She paid for a private electrician, an older man with one eye and an intact sense of loyalty, who came after hours, opened the utility box with a crowbar, and found that the external meter had been physically disconnected, not pulled, not clipped, but loosened deliberately and carefully enough that the tamper seal had been reapplied. "Someone knew what they were doing," he muttered. This wasn't amateur. She paid him cash and told him not to log the job. He nodded and didn't ask questions. Isabella didn't call the police. There was no point. Every time she had reached out, the answers came back thinner, more diluted, until she began to suspect her name had been internally flagged not as a criminal, but as a liability, a person more likely to cause procedural friction than provide clean answers. This wasn't about crime anymore. It was about access and denial of access. Information, services, infrastructure, all of it slowly throttled until the only path left was surrender. But she was past the threshold of surrender. There was nothing left to give. The week after the hearing, Carla sent word. The committee had submitted a partial compliance packet, but half the internal emails had been blacked out, and 3 of the required communications had been marked irretrievable due to system update. It was a stalling tactic, and a crude one. But more importantly, the packet included a document that changed everything: a draft memo, never officially sent, dated 3 months earlier, that outlined a transition plan for shoreline acquisition. Parcel 33 billion was explicitly listed under Phase 1 transfer, alongside a line item: vacancy forecast, 6 weeks post first measure. Carla forwarded it with the note, "They were never trying to shut you down. They were planning around you already being gone." That evening, Isabella didn't go home. She stayed in the shop, lights off, listening to the sound of the water and the far-off groan of the marina cranes shifting in the dark. She hadn't slept more than 3 hours in any night for nearly 2 weeks. Her hands were raw, her eyes burned from too many hours under fluorescent light, scanning legal codes and parcel maps and regional development briefs. The urge to scream had long since drained from her. What remained was something denser, quieter, like the weight of rope when it's wet and pulling against your arms. At 1:47 a.m., motion sensors pinged. She moved slowly, without sound, crossing the workshop to the rear office where the monitor feed glowed faintly. 3 figures. 2 near the dock, 1 moving along the fence line. No visible tools. No uniforms. No vehicle and frame. They weren't just passing through. They were surveying. She stayed in the shadows and recorded the feed directly to an external drive. 15 minutes later, they were gone. She sent the footage to Carla before dawn. By mid-morning, the retaliation came. A formal notice was served by courier this time, hand-delivered to her mailbox and signed with the seal of the committee. The letter accused her of coordinated defamation, unlawful surveillance, and hostile obstruction of authorized inspections. The language was elevated, calculated. They had moved beyond pressure. This was a declaration. The letter announced the committee's intent to file for immediate injunction, an emergency order, to suspend her business license in light of escalating behavioral irregularities and safety risks to the community at large. Carla responded within the hour, attaching the surveillance footage as evidence of trespassing and demanding a counter hearing for abuse of power. The reply came not from the committee but from the Office of the Municipal Liaison, stating that due to escalating legal complications, the matter would be deferred to county-level review. Isabella understood what that meant. The committee was trying to push the fight out of local hands and into broader jurisdiction, where everything moved slower, where memory faded quicker, where cases became statistics and personalities disappeared into docket numbers. It was exile by paperwork. She made one final decision. She called a reporter. Not from the local paper, those desks were long compromised, but someone from a neighboring district who had once written about shoreline misappropriation in another town. She sent over the documents, the footage, the citations. She didn't ask for a story. She asked for storage, a safeguard. If something happens, she said flatly over the phone, this is the context. The journalist didn't promise anything, just agreed to hold the materials. That same night, Isabella made copies of everything twice and stored them in separate, hidden locations. She wrote down her full legal timeline on a single roll of butcher paper and pinned it to the shop wall like a battle map. She walked the perimeter of the property one final time with a flashlight, tracing each fence post, noting every irregularity, every angle the security cameras didn't fully catch. She didn't expect another visit. She was counting on it. At 4:13 a.m., it came. This time they brought tools. The security feed caught everything: 3 men in contractor uniforms, faces obscured, moving with mechanical speed. They began cutting through the far west side of the fence, using bolt cutters on the chain links. One of them had a canister probably intended for accelerant. Another placed a marker stake on the gravel near the southwest corner. It wasn't vandalism. It was preparation. Survey stakes meant one thing: intended development. Isabella didn't call for help. She turned on the floodlights, stepped out onto the lot, and fired a single warning shot into the air. The men scattered. No confrontation. No defiance. They ran like animals, and within 60 seconds they were gone. But they left the canister behind. It was labeled in dry erase marker with a date and time: tomorrow at midnight. A planned burn, or something worse. She called Carla before sunrise. "This isn't political anymore," her lawyer said after a long pause. "This is criminal." "I know. Do you want to go to the press?" "No," Isabella said. "I want them in court." And so, for the first time in a decade, a legacy business owner filed not just a complaint against the committee but a civil suit. Targeted malice, procedural abuse, attempted property interference, endangerment. It wasn't about the hearing anymore. It was about exposure, record, and consequence. The following morning, the fence was welded shut, cameras doubled, locks reinforced. The deliveries resumed, not because the danger was over, but because now it had a name, and names could be dragged into the light. The courtroom was colder than Isabella expected. Not physically, though the air conditioning did hum in that way municipal buildings always seem to overdo, but in tone, in decorum, in the practiced expressions on every face in the room. No one spoke louder than necessary. Everything was filed, dated, observed. The pace was glacial, deliberate. And yet, as she sat there at the petitioner's table, her boots planted firm on the scuffed floor beneath her, she felt none of the weight she had imagined would live in this moment. The fear had burned off weeks ago. The fatigue had settled into routine. What remained now was only clarity. The judge presiding over the civil hearing was not local. He had been assigned from a neighboring district precisely to avoid allegations of internal bias, and though he seemed unimpressed with both sides, he gave Carla space to lay out the case without interruption. It began with the timeline, the initial unauthorized dumpsters, the procedural irregularities, the denials of service, the utilities interference, the trespassing, the vandalism. And finally, the attempt documented in full motion capture detail to mark Isabella's land for what could only be described as covert acquisition. Each incident was presented not as spectacle, but as evidence of a sustained, coordinated effort to remove a lawful, long-standing business from its rightful place on a parcel that had become inconvenient to a private agenda. Karen Flowers was present, seated across from Isabella, but she did not testify. Her attorneys did most of the talking, 2 men in trim suits who seemed increasingly strained the longer the hearing progressed. They argued the incidents were coincidental, misinterpreted, outside the jurisdiction of the committee's formal responsibility. They tried to paint Isabella as reactionary, overprotective, unstable. Carla dismantled those characterizations with the quiet precision of someone who had studied her opponent's playbook from cover to cover. Every document was verified. Every witness called had direct relevance. Every recorded incident was anchored in law, not emotion. When the final motion was read into record, the room sat still for several seconds before the judge closed the folder in front of him and asked one final question of the defendants: was there, at any point, a written record of coordinated action taken against parcel 33 billion with the express purpose of rendering the business non-viable? The lead defense attorney paused. He did not answer. Instead, he asked for a recess. The judge gave him 15 minutes. When the court reconvened, the answer was delivered not in argument, but in silence. The defense declined to continue. The judge made his ruling within the hour. The committee was found to have acted outside the scope of their authority in at least 3 documented instances, each one contributing directly to sustained economic damage, emotional distress, and unlawful interference with business operations. The court ordered the committee to pay compensatory damages, issued a permanent injunction against any further administrative action targeting Parcel 33 billion, and required the municipal liaison to appoint a third-party oversight committee to review all pending land use policies initiated within the last 2 years. The ruling was final. There would be no appeal. When Isabella stepped out of the building, the air smelled like sea salt and hot pavement. Carla walked beside her in silence until they reached the lot where Isabella's truck was parked. No cameras, no microphones, no spectators, just the sound of gulls over the rooftops and the low rumble of a distant boat engine heading inland. Carla turned to her finally and asked, "Do you feel anything?" Isabella thought about it. Then she said, "I feel finished." It wasn't triumph. It wasn't celebration. It was the clean, empty exhale of something long withheld. The sound of a storm that had passed without taking the house with it. Back at the shop, things didn't change overnight. Some clients came back quickly. Others hesitated. A few had already signed new contracts with younger services further up the coast. That didn't bother her. She didn't want gratitude. She didn't want to be anyone's symbol. She just wanted her workbench, her tools, and the sound of a sander against hull wood. The routine returned, slowly, one job, then two. She replaced the burnt floodlight with a better one, rebuilt the fence where it had been cut, sanded and stained the dock by hand, slat by slat, until it gleamed under the sun like it had the summer she first worked it as a teenager. The committee, as it had existed, was dissolved. Karen Flowers resigned 2 weeks after the ruling, citing health concerns and an increased need to spend time with family. She gave no interviews, no farewell letters. Her property was quietly listed for sale 3 months later, and by the end of the year she was gone. The new oversight body appointed to replace the committee moved slower, filed fewer memos, and had no visible interest in commercial displacement. There were no new inspections, no more flags in the gravel, no strange cars idling at the edge of the lot. The mail arrived on time. The lights stayed on. The permits were renewed without protest. And though Isabella never trusted bureaucracy again, she no longer had to sleep with a crowbar behind the door. One night, in late summer, she stood on the dock and looked out across the dark water. The moon cast a wide white path across the bay, and for the first time in what felt like years, she couldn't feel anyone watching. She stayed there for a long time, arms folded over the rail, until her knees stiffened and the breeze turned cool. Before going back inside, she reached into her pocket and took out the last thing her father had given her before he died, a rusted brass key with no door. The one he always said opens nothing but reminds you what shouldn't be locked. She hung it on a nail by the shop door. It didn't matter if anyone else understood what it meant. Because now, for the first time in a long time, everything that mattered was right where it belonged. And no one was coming to take it.